The gods have throne guardians.
This is a rare Ethiopian Orthodox Bible manuscript.
The Book of Enoch is part of the literature that's trying to explain that.
At the same time, Mel Gibson is in Rome at Cinecittà Studios working on what he has described as the most important movie of his career. But the version of Jesus he seems determined to bring to the screen is not the one most Western audiences grew up hearing about from the standard Bible. According to this line of thought, parts of that broader tradition were pushed aside long ago by religious authorities who shaped the canon and controlled what later generations would read. That raises a disturbing possibility. If certain texts were left out, what exactly was removed with them? Gibson has been moving in that direction for years. In 2004, he released The Passion of the Christ, filmed in Aramaic, Latin, and Hebrew, with no effort to make it feel safer or more marketable for mainstream viewers. The film focused on the last 12 hours of Jesus' life and showed them with intense physical and emotional force. Viewers saw the whipping, the mocking, the crown of thorns, and the painful journey to Calvary in a way few religious films had ever attempted. Some critics said it went too far. Many viewers saw it as one of the most uncompromising depictions of Christ's suffering ever put on film. Made for a relatively controlled budget, the movie went on to earn more than $600 million worldwide and remained the highest-grossing R-rated film in US box office history for many years. Even so, Gibson has repeatedly said that The Passion was never the full story. For more than 2 decades, he has been trying to complete what he sees as the next chapter. He has spoken about the follow-up as a project he could never abandon, even during the years when his standing in Hollywood was under intense pressure. Ancient Jewish writings do make occasional reference to supernatural beings and cosmic conflict. And that matters because Gibson's sequel appears to be drawing from material far beyond a simple retelling of Easter morning. The film is now officially known as The Resurrection of the Christ. It is planned as a 2-part release, with Lionsgate handling distribution and reports placing the budget around $100 million. Production is underway at Cinecittà Studios in Rome. The first installment is expected on Good Friday in 2027, and the second is scheduled to follow 40 days later on Ascension Day. What makes the project especially unusual is the scope Gibson himself has described. In a 2022 interview with the National Catholic Register, he explained that the movie would not unfold in a straightforward chronological way. Instead, it would move across time, linking the resurrection to events in the past, the present, and realities beyond the visible world. He said the story needed to begin with the fall of the angels. And to tell that story, he argued, the film would have to enter an entirely different realm. Then came the line that drew so much attention. He said the story would have to go to hell. Later, during his appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience, Gibson pushed that idea even further. He said he had been developing 2 versions of the screenplay, one more conventional, and another far more surreal and expansive. He described that second version as feeling almost like an acid trip. His meaning was clear. This would not be a small, restrained biblical drama. It would move through other realms, descend into hell, and portray the fall of the angels in a way Western religious cinema has rarely even attempted. That journey, Christ moving through the heavens, confronting rebellious spiritual powers, and descending into hell, was not invented by a modern director. Versions of that idea were already being written down nearly 2,000 years ago. One of the most important texts tied to that tradition is the Book of Enoch.
The Book of Enoch is never considered scripture by the Jews, but ends up in the Ethiopian Bible.
It was never accepted as scripture in mainstream Judaism, but it survived in the biblical tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And that is what makes this so striking. These ideas were not preserved by Hollywood writers or recent theologians trying to make Christianity sound more mysterious. They were carried forward by Ethiopian monks, many of them living in remote mountain monasteries carved into rock. What they protected for centuries now seems to be colliding with what could become one of the most ambitious religious films ever made. But before focusing on Ethiopia, there is a more immediate question. Why does this text matter so much? Because it may point to something many people never seriously consider. That important material connected to early religious belief was left outside the Bible most Western Christians know today. And that decision may not have been accidental. The Book of Enoch was composed centuries before the birth of Jesus, possibly as early as the 3rd century BC. For most of Western history, it remained outside the reach of ordinary readers. Yet Ethiopian scribes and monks continued to preserve it, and within its pages is a portrayal of a heavenly figure so detailed and so familiar that the connection is difficult to ignore. In chapter 46, Enoch describes an exalted figure whose head is white like wool, whose presence radiates glory, and who stands in a heavenly court surrounded by fire. Angels bow before him. The wicked face judgment. At the center of the scene is a majestic being invested with universal authority. He is identified with titles such as the Son of Man, the Chosen One, and the Righteous Judge. Again and again, this figure appears not simply as a wise teacher, but as a cosmic ruler who decides the fate of humanity. Now compare that with Revelation 1:14, written by John of Patmos, around the end of the 1st century AD. John describes a figure whose hair is white like wool, whose eyes burn like fire, and whose presence is overwhelming in power and glory. Both passages include imagery of brilliant metal refined in fire. Both describe a voice with the force of rushing waters or thunder. Both present a figure whose speech carries judicial power. Both emphasize blazing light, fiery eyes, and overwhelming authority. The overlap is hard to dismiss. The details line up too closely to feel random. That raises a serious possibility. What appears in Revelation may not be completely new imagery, but part of an older stream of religious tradition that had already been circulating for centuries. If so, then Revelation may not stand alone. It may be drawing from a much deeper source that later readers were never encouraged to explore. Scholar George Nicholsburg of the University of Iowa spent years producing one of the most important English commentaries on 1st Enoch. When he compared Enoch and Revelation closely, he concluded that the parallels were too strong to ignore. He also admitted that the significance of that connection was not something he absorbed all at once. It took time to fully grasp what those similarities might mean. According to that argument, the writer of Revelation was not creating an entirely new vision. He was drawing from the Enoch tradition, repeating imagery and ideas that were already ancient by the time John began writing. And there is another detail that makes this even harder to dismiss. The Epistle of Jude, which remains in the Bible today, directly quotes the Book of Enoch in verses 14 and 15 in language that closely mirrors the earlier text. Jude presents Enoch not as a curiosity, but as a prophetic authority. In other words, Enoch was not some forgotten outsider text sitting on the edge of Jewish thought. It was part of the wider religious conversation during the Second Temple period, helping shape how many people understood angels, judgment, and the coming of divine justice. Early Christian writers such as Tertullian and Irenaeus referred to it openly and treated it as genuine revelation. Modern scholarship on the period also shows that Enoch was widely known. It was not marginal, and it was not hidden. It belonged to the same intellectual and spiritual world out of which the New Testament emerged. That matters because the New Testament writers do not appear to have been ignorant of it. They knew its language. They used its themes. In some cases, they seem to have treated it with real authority. Yet over time, that status changed. A few centuries later, church leaders moved away from it, and ordinary believers in much of the Christian world were no longer encouraged to read it. By the 4th century, that separation had become far more official. At the Council of Laodicea in 363 AD, texts associated with Enoch were excluded from the approved reading tradition in much of the broader church. From that point on, the book was increasingly treated as suspect or dangerous. But suppressing a text is not the same as erasing it. Not all copies disappeared. In fact, some survived far from the main centers of the Mediterranean power. And what survived was not just an unusual description of a heavenly figure. The material in Enoch offers a much larger framework, one that expands the story of Christ, judgment, rebellion, and the unseen world in ways that go far beyond what most Western Christians were taught. That may be one reason Gibson's current project in Rome seems so different from the usual resurrection film. If he is drawing from traditions like these, then he is not simply retelling Easter. He is reaching into a much older and stranger religious imagination. What makes that possible is the community that preserved these writings when much of the rest of the Christian world did not. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church traces its Christian history back to the 4th century under King Ezana of Aksum, making Ethiopia one of the oldest Christian civilizations in the world. Long before Christianity spread through much of Europe, Ethiopian believers had already formed a strong scriptural tradition of their own. Their sacred texts were preserved in Ge'ez, an ancient liturgical language that became a vehicle for Christian writing in its own right. Then history took a turn that changed everything. As Islamic expansion moved across North Africa in the 7th century, Ethiopia became increasingly isolated from the major political and theological struggles of the Mediterranean world. Surrounded by distance, desert, and hostile territory, it was cut off from many of the church councils, power struggles, and doctrinal conflicts that shaped Christianity elsewhere. That separation became a form of protection. Because Ethiopian Christianity stood apart from many of the theological purges and canon disputes that reshaped the faith in other regions, it preserved texts that others abandoned or rejected. In the mountains of Tigray, monks in remote monasteries carved into cliffs continued copying manuscripts generation after generation. These were not easy places to reach. Some could only be accessed by climbing with ropes or by gripping the rock face by hand. Inside those monasteries, by the light of oil lamps, scribes continued their work. They made ink from natural materials. They prepared parchment from animal skin. Every manuscript demanded patience, discipline, and time. Some took months, others took years. The work damaged their eyesight, bent their bodies, and strained their hands. But they kept going because they believed they were preserving sacred truth, not dangerous literature. To them, these were not forbidden books. They were part of the revelation they had received and guarded for centuries. And the evidence of what they saved is extraordinary. According to this tradition, missionaries from Syria traveled into what was then known as the Kingdom of Aksum and brought with them a large body of sacred literature. That matters because Ethiopia did not inherit only a narrow selection of Christian writings. It received a much broader library of texts, and in many cases, it preserved them when other parts of the Christian world did not. Among the strongest examples are the Garima Gospels. A team associated with Oxford dated them to somewhere between 330 and 660 AD, placing them among the oldest surviving illustrated Christian manuscripts in the world. French art historian Jacques Mercier, who helped draw global attention to these works, described his first encounter with them as deeply overwhelming. What stunned researchers was not only their age, but their condition. Richly colored images from the life of Christ, still preserved after more than 15 centuries in a remote Ethiopian monastery that had remained almost completely unknown to the Western world. And the manuscripts are only part of the story. The Ethiopian Bible contains as many as 88 books. That stands in sharp contrast to the 66 books found in most Protestant Bibles, and the 73 recognized in the Catholic canon. This is not a minor difference or a technical detail. It means entire bodies of religious writing remained part of Ethiopian Christianity while disappearing from the biblical experience of most Western believers. Those additional texts include works such as Enoch, Jubilees, the Ascension of Isaiah, writings connected to the Maccabees, and the Book of the Covenant. These were not random additions. Many of them were known to early Christians, cited in religious thought, and treated with seriousness in the formative centuries of the faith. They helped shape the worldview of some of the earliest Christian communities before later church authorities narrowed the range of texts that ordinary believers were encouraged to read. That is where the argument becomes more provocative. If these writings were once part of the wider conversation around Christian belief, then removing them did more than shorten the Bible. It changed how generations of believers imagined Christ, the unseen world, judgment, and salvation. And that brings us to the image of Jesus preserved in these Ethiopian traditions. In much of Western art, Jesus is usually presented in familiar terms: calm, compassionate, approachable, gentle in expression, comforting in presence. He is the shepherd, the forgiver, the friend of the broken. Those themes are undeniably part of the Christian story. But they are not the only themes. The Ethiopian texts present something larger and more overwhelming. In them, Christ is not only merciful, he is cosmic in scale, impossible to reduce to a sentimental image. He is Savior, but also Judge. He heals, but he also commands. He brings comfort, but his presence can also terrify. The descriptions emphasize radiance, fire, authority, and glory. His hair gleams like bright wool in the light. His eyes burn with intensity. His face shines with a brilliance almost beyond endurance, yet without losing its peace. His voice does not merely speak to individuals. It carries across creation itself, shaking what is fixed and commanding the attention of both angels and fallen powers. In this portrait, Christ is not domesticated. He is not softened into a safe religious symbol. He is immense, disruptive, and fully sovereign. His presence affects everything around him. Time, space, and the order of reality itself seem to respond to who he is. Within this tradition, that is not treated as decorative language or dramatic exaggeration. It is presented as part of the earliest Christian understanding of Christ's true majesty, a vision preserved in Ethiopia while much of the rest of the Christian world embraced a more restrained and more manageable image. The result is a very different picture of Jesus. Not less loving, but far more powerful. Not less compassionate, but impossible to contain. But that description of Christ is only the beginning. The more disruptive idea in these Ethiopian writings is not how Jesus appears. It is what he seems to say about human nature, spiritual identity, and access to God. In one passage, Jesus tells humanity, "You are not children of dust, but children of light." That statement carries enormous weight. In much of Western Christian teaching, the emphasis falls on human weakness. People are fallen, sinful, fragile, and unable to save themselves without outside intervention. But this alternative tradition shifts the focus in a very different direction. If human beings are children of light, then the divine is not completely distant or locked away behind institutions. It is already present at the deepest level of the soul. That changes the meaning of salvation. Instead of being presented mainly as something handed down through religious authority, salvation becomes an awakening, a recognition of a divine reality already planted within. In that framework, the kingdom of God within you is not just symbolic language. It is a literal spiritual truth, and the implications do not stop there. Some of these Ethiopian texts also contain warnings that sound, to supporters of this tradition, almost prophetic. One passage says that in later times people would make gods with their own hands, and then bow to what they themselves had created, rather than to the spirit of truth. Seen through that lens, the transformation of Christ's image in European art takes on a new meaning. During the Renaissance and afterward, artists increasingly portrayed Jesus with features shaped by European ideals, and over time, that image became familiar, dominant, and almost unquestioned. In the eyes of critics, that visual tradition gradually replaced the more radiant, cosmic, and overwhelming Christ described in older texts. This is why some argue those writings were pushed aside. Once Christianity became tied to imperial power in the 4th century under Constantine, a scattered spiritual movement had to be reorganized into a more unified institution. A religion linked to empire could not easily allow unlimited diversity of belief or competing sources of authority. Texts that emphasize direct experience of God could become dangerous in that environment. The Ascension of Isaiah suggested that ordinary believers could receive divine visions without priestly control. The Book of Enoch described revelation as something disclosed through heavenly journeys, rather than through officially approved gatekeepers. And Ethiopian teachings about divine light within the human person raised an even more destabilizing possibility. If God is already present within every soul, then institutional religion no longer holds a monopoly on access to the sacred. That is where theology begins to overlap with power. If a person can encounter God directly, why would a priest be necessary as the only channel? Why would salvation depend entirely on the institution? Why would people need to submit to a system that claimed exclusive authority over grace, forgiveness, and divine truth? Those are not small doctrinal questions. They touch money, hierarchy, and control. For centuries, the medieval church built enormous influence in part by presenting itself as the necessary guardian of salvation. Tithes, indulgences, and the many religious fees tied to baptisms, weddings, funerals, and other rites all rested on a central assumption. Ordinary believers needed the church in order to stand rightly before God. From this perspective, texts that challenged that assumption were not merely controversial. They were threatening. So those writings were pushed aside. Enoch was excluded from the accepted canon in much of the Christian world after the 4th century. The Ascension of Isaiah was branded apocryphal. If a person can encounter God directly, why would a priest be necessary as the only channel? Why would salvation depend entirely on the institution? Why would people need to submit to a system that claimed exclusive authority over grace, forgiveness, and divine truth? Those are not small doctrinal questions. Ordinary believers needed the church in order to stand rightly before God. From this perspective, texts that challenged that assumption were not merely controversial. They were threatening. Control the texts. and you control the spiritual imagination of the people. In the system that eventually took shape, salvation was said to move through authorized structures, and those structures pointed back to Rome. But not every manuscript was destroyed. Some survived. And according to this argument, the reason Mel Gibson can now explore a version of Christ unlike anything Western audiences have seen is because those suppressed traditions were preserved in Ethiopian monasteries after others tried to erase them. At the center of this discussion is one text in particular, the Ascension of Isaiah. And if supporters of this theory are right, it may offer the clearest window yet into the kind of story Gibson is preparing to film. The Ascension of Isaiah is usually dated to the late 1st or early 2nd century, placing it close in time to parts of the New Testament itself. In that text, the prophet Isaiah is taken on a guided ascent through 7 levels of heaven. This is not presented as a loose symbol or vague mystical image. It is described as an ordered universe made up of distinct realms, each populated by different beings, each governed by its own spiritual conditions, and each bringing the traveler closer to the divine presence. It is a far more layered cosmology than the simpler picture many Western Christians inherited. In the first heaven, angelic beings are shown overseeing the earth. In the second, the movements of the stars and the heavens are directed. In the third, Isaiah sees paradise, including the tree of life. As he ascends, the imagery becomes increasingly dramatic. He passes living gates of fire, walks across surfaces that shine like crystallized starlight, and enters spaces that seem built not from stone or wood, but from pure spiritual power. By the time he reaches the 6th heaven, the glory of what he sees becomes nearly unbearable. The beings there radiate a level of splendor that human strength can scarcely endure, and Isaiah collapses under the weight of it. Yet even that magnificence is only a reflection of a greater reality still above him. Then comes the 7th heaven, the highest realm, a place no created being could naturally survive. There Isaiah beholds the Beloved, a figure of supreme authority and radiance, ready to descend into human history. That is where the text becomes especially striking. It describes Christ's descent not as a sudden drop from heaven to earth, but as a deliberate movement through each level of reality. At every stage, he conceals his true glory so that the beings in that realm can perceive him without recognizing the fullness of who he is. In the 6th heaven, he appears like a being belonging to that order. In the 5th, he takes on the appearance of the 5th. At each step, his radiance is veiled more deeply, not because his power is diminished, but because he willingly restrains it. The idea is profound. The infinite makes itself small enough to enter the finite world. Layer by layer, divinity accepts limitation. Glory is hidden inside weakness. By the time Christ is born in Bethlehem, even the lower angelic powers see only a human child. They do not perceive the full cosmic reality concealed within that fragile body. In this framework, only the Father and the Spirit fully know who he is. That changes the meaning of the crucifixion. It is no longer only the execution of a holy man or the suffering of a messianic figure. It becomes a cosmic rupture, the source of life entering death itself, and, in doing so, shaking the structure of reality. And the resurrection becomes more than the return of a body to life. It is the full unveiling of the power that had been hidden. Every chosen limit is cast off. Every veil is removed. The glory once restrained in human flesh breaks forth in its fullness. Seen this way, Gibson's comments make much more sense. When he told Joe Rogan that he wanted to show Christ moving through other realms, descending into hell, and witnessing the fall of angels, he was describing a path already mapped out in ancient religious literature. The Ascension of Isaiah had laid out a version of that journey nearly 2,000 years ago. So from this perspective, Gibson is not inventing a new mythology. He is drawing from an older one, a tradition that survived outside the boundaries of the Western canon and remained hidden from most believers for centuries. The story was never entirely gone. It was preserved, copied, and waiting to be found again. In Ethiopian Christianity today, Christ is often understood as the Lord of the universe, not only merciful and near, but also immense in glory, authority, and power. Ethiopian sacred art reflects that vision clearly. He is often portrayed with dark skin, intense eyes, and a radiant halo of gold. Fully human, yet unmistakably more than human. The emphasis is different from what many people in the West are used to. In Western tradition, Jesus is often presented first as comforting and approachable. In the Ethiopian view, the first response is reverence. You are meant to feel the weight of who is standing before you feel the comfort he brings. That difference becomes even more striking in the way Christ's miracles are understood. In these traditions, his miracles are not simply compassionate acts performed for individuals. They are moments when the original order of creation is restored. When he calms the storm, it is not just weather obeying a command. Nature recognizes its maker and becomes still. When he walks on water, the sea itself responds to the one who called it into existence. When he heals the sick, he is not merely relieving pain. He is repairing what has been broken in creation. When he raises the dead, he is not doing something theatrical or symbolic. He is exercising authority over life itself and calling it back where it belongs. In that vision, every miracle points to the same truth. The whole universe came into being through him and still answers to his voice. Christ is understood as the living word, the sustaining force through which all reality continues to exist. Light, matter, sound, and life are all held together through his presence. Some people find that idea remarkable because it sounds unexpectedly close to modern language about energy, frequency, and the structure of reality, even though these texts were written nearly 2,000 years ago. The point is clear. If that divine word were withdrawn, creation would not slowly fade. It would stop altogether. Scholars who spent years studying Ge'ez manuscripts have tried to make that importance clear. One of them, Dr. Steve Delamarter, devoted much of his career to cataloging Ethiopian texts and helping preserve them through manuscript work in the United States. He and others argued that Western scholarship had made a serious mistake by treating these writings as side material or regional curiosities. They were not secondary traditions. They were part of the early Christian world and deserved to be studied as such. That argument is gaining more attention today. Modern digitization projects and manuscript studies are continuing to reveal how advanced Ethiopia's Christian intellectual culture really was. The Garima Gospels, for example, point to a sophisticated tradition of illuminated manuscript production in the Kingdom of Aksum during late antiquity. At a time when much of Europe had not yet developed anything comparable, Ethiopia was already preserving major Christian works in a highly refined artistic and literary tradition. As more of that evidence becomes available, historians are being forced to reconsider where some of the most important Christian scholarship and preservation work actually took place during the first millennium. This is where the Ethiopian tradition and Mel Gibson's coming film seem to meet in a way that is hard to ignore. The familiar Jesus of later European painting, the gentle, softened figure shaped by centuries of Western religious art, may not be the full picture at all. The more overwhelming Christ described in Enoch, the descending cosmic figure found in the Ascension of Isaiah, the living word who upholds creation itself. That is the older vision. And for most of Christian history in the West, that version was either minimized, forgotten, or never seriously presented to ordinary believers. Gibson has long said that he sees Scripture as real history, not symbolic fiction. He openly identifies as a serious Christian and speaks about the Bible with deep conviction. Yet the version of Christ he keeps describing for this new film, a Christ moving across realms, confronting fallen powers, descending into hell, and crossing the boundaries between heaven and earth, does not come naturally from the standard Western presentation of the resurrection story. It aligns much more closely with the broader tradition preserved in Ethiopian Christianity. Whether Gibson arrived there by directly studying these sources or by following scriptural themes to similar conclusions, the overlap is difficult to miss. If his film truly reflects the vision he has described, then audiences in 2027 may be seeing something very different from the usual cinematic Jesus. Instead of the familiar softened image, they may encounter a Christ of enormous cosmic authority, one who willingly hides infinite glory in human flesh, submits to death, and then rises in a burst of unveiled divine power that changes the structure of reality itself. The monks who preserved these traditions could never have imagined any of this. They did not copy manuscripts because they expected global recognition. They were not trying to influence modern cinema. They copied because they believed these writings mattered. They prayed, they preserved, and they passed them on. Century after century, often in isolation, they guarded a vision of Christ they believed the world should not lose. For generations, they kept that tradition alive quietly, far from the centers of political and religious power. And now, after so many centuries, that hidden stream of Christian thought may finally be reaching a global audience. And that leaves one final question. If a vision of Christ this different could remain unknown to billions for so long, what else is still sitting in remote monasteries, waiting to be opened?